I'm Jared Yantzi, a third-year agriculture business student studying at the University of Guelph, and I was on a co-op term with Elric this past fall semester. I grew up on a cash crop and veal farm just outside of Tavistock, Ontario. I want to thank Tim Nelson and Jean Howden for the opportunity to present here today. When Tim first told me back in September that part of my role with Elric was to do some research about the rise of cultured meat, I'll be honest, I was a little skeptical. I didn't know anything about it. At first I thought he was talking about meat that is eaten more often in different cultures. But when I first began researching it, it was hard to get my head around how crazy of an idea it is for meat to be grown in a lab and go from being this to being that. But as I've learned about this concept, I've come to realize that it does have some potential to disrupt the meat industry. By no means do I think that I'm an expert in the field, but I'm going to share here today some of the things that I've learned about it and give an introduction into the topic. The idea of growing meat in a lab isn't a new concept. Back in 1932, Winston Churchill predicted that in 50 years, we will grow the breast and wings of a chicken separately. Well, Winston may have been a few years off, but his prediction is beginning to look like a possibility. The man pictured here is Mark Post, a scientist and professor from Holland who is kind of like the godfather of cultured meat. He created the first ever hamburger grown in a lab back in 2013, and it received decent reviews. It was a little bland, but it had the same texture and feel as a normal hamburger. The only major problem being is that it costs $330,000 to produce. So before I go too far into my presentation, I want to make sure everyone here knows exactly what cultured meat is and how it is produced. There's a good diagram here that shows the entire process, but I have a video that I think will do a better job of explaining it than I will.
The meat of the future will likely be lab-grown. Compared to our conventional methods of getting meat on the table, lab-grown meat, which debuted in 2013, doesn't involve slaughtering of animals, nor does it require as many environmental resources. Compared to other livestock, raising cows require 28 times more land and 11 times more water. The World Wildlife Fund adds that beef production drives 25% of global land use and forestry emissions. And in the near future, lab-grown meat is going to be cheaper, faster, and more environmentally friendly to produce for a growing population. But how exactly does one grow meat in a lab? The process isn't as weird as you might think. Currently, the most successful method involves harvesting stem cells from cows. Stem cells are the building blocks of essentially everything, from muscles to organs, from which muscle tissue is harvested from the live animal in what is said to be a harmless, painless procedure. The tissue is made up of muscle and fat cells, which the scientists separate from one another. What we need are the muscles, which are then dissected and cultured. Cell culturing is where a cell is removed from a plant or animal and then put into a favorable artificial environment, usually some type of substrate that supplies essential nutrients like amino acids and carbohydrates to grow. All it takes is just one singular muscle stem cell to grow up to 1 trillion muscle cells. The newly grown muscle cells naturally merge together to form tiny myotubes, which are then placed in a ring. The muscle cell's tendency to contract frequently causes them to grow into a small strand of muscle tissue. The muscle tissue tubes are then layered together to form a hamburger shape. One muscle cell has the potential to turn into 1 trillion muscle tissue strands, which is a lot of burgers. The lab-grown hamburgers don't quite look like normal hamburgers and are much paler in color and blander in taste. But as scientists point out, that blander taste is a fair trade for an efficient way to create protein and feed the world's growing population. The price of lab-grown hamburgers has already dropped from $325,000 to just over $11 per patty. While it is still pricey compared to a Big Mac, which costs $4.79 on average, the price will likely drop in the future as production methods are streamlined, meaning that more likely than not, lab-grown meat will be on your dinner plate in the near future.
Now, maybe it's because of my roots of being raised on a farm and working with livestock, but I have a difficult time calling something made in a petri dish as meat. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to try and address it as cultured protein. Now, we've seen this kind of debate between real and alternative products before. As you can see in the graph, in the 1940s, the idea of mass consumption of margarine was insane. But by the 1960s, it was consumed more than butter, and it maintained that trend for 50 years. During the early years of the margarine takeover, there were anti-margarine laws and protests to ban it by dairy farmers, and in some states they even required margarine to be colored pink in order to differentiate it from butter. More recently, in Australia in particular, dairy farmers have been lobbying against soy and almond drinks that use milk in their names. Additionally, this past summer, the EU court ordered dairy substitutes such as soya milk and tofu butter to rebrand their names without including the dairy product name in it. Will we see the same thing done at some point against cultured meat? I think it's an easier argument to be made against plant-based meat alternative products, but it becomes difficult when it is this cell-cultured meat. It really comes down to how the livestock industry and society as a whole define meat. One thing you will notice about the major companies that are involved in cultured protein is that they are directly using meat in their name. Ever since Mark Post created the first cell-cultured hamburger back in 2013, it has been an international race to see who can produce the highest quantity of cultured protein at the most reasonable price. Even though nobody has succeeded, these companies are inching closer to having cell-cultured protein in our grocery stores. The biggest player is Memphis Meats. They're based in the Silicon Valley and they are creating beef and chicken in the lab. Next is Moza Meat, a Dutch company involving Mark Post. They're sitting in the driver's seat in Europe as there is a lot of interest in meat alternatives over there, and they've been receiving government funding in order to try and meet that demand. Then there's Finless Foods, another Silicon Valley company. They're using cell culture to grow fish products. Lastly, there's Super Meats, an Israeli company creating poultry products. Then there are companies such as Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat. They are different alternative protein companies in the fact that their products are soy-based. They have made their products so they essentially bleed when they're raw and they sizzle on the grill just like a normal hamburger. They have received hundreds of millions of dollars in investments and are now producing at mass scale and selling across the US. Some of these investors include billionaires such as Bill Gates and Richard Branson. They are huge supporters of cultured protein because of the environmental implications and animal welfare issues currently surrounding livestock farming. And just this past August, it was announced that major livestock processor Cargill was investing into Memphis Meats. And then, just about a month ago, it was announced that Tyson Foods had made an investment into Memphis Meats. For cultured protein, it is not a matter of if it will be available to buy in our grocery stores, but it's rather a matter of when. But even if these cultured protein companies are receiving all of this funding and money and eventually begin producing at a mass scale, they still need people to buy it. There was an interesting survey conducted by two Australian researchers from the University of Queensland that looked at the potential consumers of cultured protein in the USA. Some of the standout points for me from this survey was that 65% of the 700 randomly selected people said that they would be willing to try cultured protein, and 33% would eat it regularly and eat it as a replacement from regular meat. If that is truly the case at an entire North American level, I think we're looking at cultured protein having a bigger impact than maybe what we originally thought. Other interesting results from this study were that vegetarians and vegans are less likely to try cultured protein than meat eaters. Coincidentally enough, that's exactly what these cultured protein companies want. They aren't looking to transition vegetarians to eating their fake meat, but rather they want regular meat eaters to switch to their alternative products. Now, when looking further into the distance of what cultured protein will look like, there is a nonprofit research institute in the United States that is building the field of cellular agriculture. It's called New Harvest. and they have research projects that not only focus on reinventing meat, but the entire food industry. They're in the process of creating eggs that don't require hens to lay them, and milk that doesn't need cows to produce it. They just use the cells from these products to grow it. They, as well as everyone else involved in alternative protein, envision a future of where this fake meat would be grown in bioreactors and would look similar to a brewery. There's even a possibility that one day you could grow your own meat in your home, just like you can make bread in your bread maker. So what are the next steps for the livestock industry? Like I've said, I think we're at a point where cultured protein will be an option for customers to buy soon enough, and there's nothing that can be done about that. I think we're going to have debates about what the true definition of meat is and whether it's worth fighting against the companies that use that term for their lab-grown creation. But I think the biggest thing is research. We need to continue research focusing on feed conversion efficiencies, greenhouse gas emissions, animal welfare, and other issues that maybe give the livestock industry a bad reputation among the majority of society. We need to know why some consumers are inclined to make the transition to buying cultured protein. We need to conduct consumer studies to see how many people will purchase cultured protein so we understand the potential market share that it will displace. We also need to look into farming systems and find out what reduced livestock would mean for the ecosystem and sustainability of crop production. And lastly, we need research on the potential impact of eating less natural animal products on human nutrition. To wrap things up on a personal note, as a livestock farmer who wants a future involving livestock, I find it a little concerning to see the developments in cultured protein. With how unattached a lot of people are to agriculture these days, and the bad reputation livestock farmers get from some of society, I think the livestock sector will feel the effects of this. It may not be substantial, but there will be negative effects nonetheless. Thank you for listening.